Hello everyone.
Welcome back to Book Club on Telescola. We are your hosts. I'm Mr. Darrell, and this is...
I am Miss Maka.
Ms. Maka, we have a classic author to talk about today, Henry James.
Yep, and the novel for today is Washington Square.
Mm-hmm. Now it's the story of a sweet girl, her relationship with her unemotional father.
Mm-hmm. And their conflict, and actually the fact that this is a true story that was told by Henry's friend, and that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, of course, before we start discussing about the book, we should look at the agenda. So firstly, we introduce the new vocabulary. After that, we talk about the author, Henry James. Later, we will continue with the summary of the book.
Mm-hmm. From there, we'll move to a look at the characters. Then we'll move on to the setting of the story, and then pick out some of the main themes from this story.
Of course, and the final stage is giving you homework.
Yeah, it's always interesting to hear from people about what they think about the books that we talk about.
Of course it is. So now, Mr. Darrell, let's start with the vocabulary part.
Indeed. We have a word, it's a noun, a vow. That's how it's pronounced, a vow. It's a solemn promise or pledge or personal commitment.
აღთქმა, პირობა.
The next word is an adjective, prudent. This is to be wise or judicious in practical affairs, to be discreet, to be clever, to be serious about something.
წინდახედული, კეთილგონიერი.
Our next word is an adjective. It is impoverished. This is when you are reduced from a certain level of income to a lower level of income. You become poor.
No, გაღარიბებული.
Our next verb is to extend, and this is for something to become lengthened, increased in size, stretched out, and so on.
გაფართოვება, განვრცობა.
Our next word is a noun, spinster. This is a woman who's still unmarried past the usual age of marrying.
გაუთხოვარი ქალი.
Our next word is dismissive, an adjective, dismissive. This indicates a lack of interest, to be scornful of something, to be disdainful of something.
ქედმაღლური, უპატივცემულო.
Our next word is threat. It's a noun, an indication of, or warning of possible trouble or being at risk for something terrible.
საფრთხე, საშიშროება.
And the last word is restriction. Restriction is a noun, and it's something that restricts, like limits. It's a kind of, a limitation.
შეზღუდვა.
Well, we move to the author at this point, and that is, of course, Henry James. Now, he's been called the first of the great psychological realists of our time. He's honored as one of the greatest novelists of the English language and considered one of America's most influential critics and literary theorists.
And during the 50 years of his literary career, which spanned the period from the end of the American Civil War to the beginning of the World War I, James produced a body of different literary works, such as 36 volumes and an almost equal number of volumes of non-fiction prose. Also some kind of travel books, autobiography, some critical articles, and also letters and literary notebooks. So he was very diverse in his working style.
Well, he was born in 1843 in New York City to a rich and affluent family. Before he reached his 18th birthday, he'd lived abroad for extended periods of time. He was the younger brother. He was the younger brother to William James, who's a very famous person in his own right.
Yeah. So but I think that this kind of family background kind of gave him more chances to travel, and that's why at the age of 33 he took up residence in Europe. So first he started living in Paris, and after he moved to England, and he became a British subject in 1915, a year just before his death.
James's European influence is key to his style as well. So he's an American with this European immersion.
Yeah, and his best deal with his dominant theme, this is the illumination of the present by the sense of the past, the American present illuminated by the sense of the European past.
Mm-hmm. So he's kind of focused on the way Americans go from looking towards Europe, then looking back towards themselves, then looking towards Europe again, so going back and forth between those two influences.
Yes, and his literary career has been divided into 3 stages. So we could say the early stage, the middle years, and the last and the most productive stage.
Yeah, so the
later manner.
The later manner of his style. It's the last stage that produced the masterpieces that we talk about these days. And he was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1911, 1912, and 1916.
Yeah. So he died on 28th of February in 1916 in Chelsea, London, and he was cremated at Golden Green Crematorium as he requested. His ashes were buried in Cambridge Cemetery in Massachusetts.
Okay, that was interesting, Ms. Maka. Now we should move on, I think, to the summary of the story.
The most interesting part of the discussion, I think.
Okay, let's start with a summary now. So the novel Washington Square begins with the portrait of Dr. Austin Sloper, a respectable physician. His wife, Catherine, gives birth to a son who dies at the age of 3.
2 years later, Catherine gives birth to a daughter named Catherine, but the childbirth is difficult for her, and she dies. The daughter Catherine is the heroine of the novel. So Dr. Sloper views the daughter as a strange genetic twist of his fate. So she's not a boy that he would like to see for that time, and she is not as beautiful as her mother, and she is not clever like her father.
Sad for her.
Yeah.
When Catherine is a few years old, her aunt Penningman comes to live in the Sloper household, and Dr. Sloper finds his sister Lavinia to be excessively imaginative, unrealistic, and melodramatic. Nonetheless, Dr. Sloper thinks that Lavinia, the aunt, would be a good secondary mother, surrogate mother for Catherine.
Yes, and actually his rejection of his daughter kind of caused some kind of less confidence in Catherine, and it really kind of stopped intellectual and emotional growth. Like, not stopped, but maybe had some difficulties in it. And Sloper respects little from his daughter Catherine. For the most part, this is a very self-fulfilling prophecy.
Isn't that always what happens? If you have little expectation for something, that thing will end up being nothing for you. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now the story takes an important turn now, because Catherine meets Morris Townsend, a smooth-talking and very good-looking young man. He is the far-flung cousin of Arthur's and has been traveling the world, so he's kind of worldly, and but he's obviously a stranger now to New York society.
Yeah, and for that time we will talk about it, what importance the social status actually had, and you could see that he was new for this place. So from the very beginning, Dr. Sloper sees Morris as some kind of, lazy charmer who sees Catherine as a source of material inheritance, and at the same time, like Aunt Lavinia does such a good job of sparking up a romance between Catherine and Morris. So in this case, Aunt Lavinia goes against Mr. Sloper. Yeah.
Now, although this Morris, his motivation is economic, he is kind to Catherine and treats her with more love than the father does. And so because of that, the father finds it difficult to get Catherine away from Morris.
Yeah, but you know, he cannot really withhold Catherine's inheritance from her mother's side, but what he can do is say no for his inheritance, like from his part, and he thinks that that would be very helpful. This poses a concern for for Morris, because Catherine is only half as attractive if she comes only like with her maternal fortune and not Dr. Sloper's fortune. So father sees it just before it happens.
So once Morris realizes that he's not going to be as rich as he thought, he backs out of the marriage and then leaves town soon after. A bit later, he writes a letter, a 5-page letter from Philadelphia, and Catherine is heartbroken by all this.
Yeah, but you know, she actually keeps it as a secret. She does not say anything to her father, and Dr. Sloper is still very suspicious that Catherine is just waiting for him to die, and then she will go back to Morris. But he doesn't know anything about the truth. And when he finally dies, after many years, Mr. Morris comes back to Catherine, but of course he is rejected by her.
Now we're not going to reveal the ending, because that's the joy of reading a book like this, so we'll leave it for you to find out. But I think it's...
Yeah, of course. You will read lots of other actions and stories behind or after what's happening after the death of Mr. Sloper.
I think it's a good time to ask a question to the audience. Now, do you think the doctor was against Morris because of his social status, or because he was lying to his daughter and Morris was lying to his daughter and the doctor knew it?
I would say that both can be reasons for rejecting Morris, despite the fact that he didn't love his daughter, or at least he thinks so. Of course, he cared about her.
Yeah, it's totally up to the reader, I think, how they react on Dr. Sloper's behavior.
Some people might see him as unemotional or removed, but some people might see him as being protective.
Maybe it's again up to the reader.
Okay, let's move on to some of the characters of the story. We have, first of all, we'll look at Catherine Sloper. She is the heroine of the novel, and for most of the novel, she's surrounded by dominating individuals who seek to make decisions for her. As a young girl, and even as a young woman, Catherine finds herself unable to live up to her father's image of what a good daughter should be.
But it is not difficult for her to be a good child. But Dr. Sloper would prefer a daughter who was clever.
Oh, so very high standards.
Maybe she had those high standards, but due to the reason that he maybe idealized his wife, he could not see her.
Good point.
And we should see it by the end of the book, right? And for all of Aunt's instructions, Catherine has remained not so clever in her father's eyes. That's very important to mention. That it doesn't mean that in reality she was not clever. She just couldn't prove it to her father.
Tough situation to be in.
Yeah, and maybe let's see if she gets bored with proving something to her father.
So basically, to close up that part, basically she's a character who suffers. She suffers because of Morris's betrayal and because of her father's cruelty.
Our next character is unemotional father, Dr. Austin Sloper. So we can see he's one of the most complex characters among the Henry James's works, and we could see that he is very intelligent, but he has some problems and he becomes very weak, and he is a very prominent doctor, although he could not really save his son and his beloved wife.
The next character is Morris Townsend. This is the young man who's been around the world, comes into town. He's new to town, and he seems to be interested in Catherine just for her money. So he's got some negative characteristics as well. We find out that he's also quite selfish, and he can hurt people. So there's almost nothing that's redeemable about Morris.
Yeah. Our next character is Lavinia Penningman, who is one of the Dr. Sloper's two younger sisters, who is a very eccentric woman, but a widow of a penniless clergyman, overly dramatic. She has the functions of like being a mother for Catherine, and during the story we can see how she kind of helps Catherine, but her help goes against Catherine's father's will and what he wants. So this kind of character.
We have the other sister, Mrs. Elizabeth Almond, and unlike Lavinia, this sister has a rational temperament, and she's very kind and sympathetic towards Catherine. She's the one who points out that Dr. Sloper is cold and just uncaring.
So our next character is Mrs. Montgomery, who is the sister of Morris, and Morris actually lives with her. She has some kind of money, so she has the social status, but Morris actually refuses to work, and that is why his sister actually asks him to leave, so she no longer can withstand her brother's this laziness, we would say, something like that. And Dr. Sloper sometimes visits Mrs. Montgomery when Morris is not there, and pressures her to admit that her brother Morris is selfish, and all he wants from Catherine is her inheritance.
Very good summaries. I think it's time for a question to the audience now. Why did Catherine think that she herself was not clever?
Because when she born, she was rejected by her father, and for a long time she tried to prove her father that she was a good child, but every time she failed on it.
It's a good answer. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing worse than a child who's constantly trying to impress their parents,
yeah,
father
exactly.
or mother.
Exactly, and in this process, definitely she loses, she or he loses self-confidence.
Yeah, which is the worst thing you can lose.
Yeah, but we have the second question from the character part. Do you think Morris returned to Catherine because he regretted his behavior?
No, I think he did not regret his behavior. First, because it took him so long, and also he returned after Dr. Slope's death.
Yeah, exactly. So what took him so long, we could say.
Good question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Let's move on to the setting now. We'll look at the when. Doing a bit of calculations in the book, you can guess that Dr. Sloper is about 50 years old in the 1840s, and Catherine is about 20 years old in that time period.
By the end of the novel, and Dr. Sloper's death that happened in 1850s, this is Civil War has erupted. This is when Civil War has erupted, but this does not prohibit Catherine from saying, I like surprises, and it is so quiet now.
Yeah, although it is an exciting location, because Washington Square, it is a thoroughly American novel. The characters are as American as the setting. Indeed, Washington Square is the neighborhood in which Henry James was born, and focuses on a particular moment in time.
Yep, thank you very much. Now, let's move on and look at the main messages, the main themes of the story.
Yeah, well, what's America famous for? Independence, and that's one of the themes, gaining independence. Catherine demonstrates an independent streak from the very beginning of the novel, although it's timid at first, not very confident. When she faces opposition from her father, she puts her fledgling independence to the test, but does so after careful deliberation and personal reflection.
Yep. So we can say that after Dr. Sloper's voices, like his disapproval of Catherine's engagement with Morris, Catherine made a discovery of a very different sort. It had become vivid to her that there was a great excitement in trying to be a good daughter. She had an entirely new feeling, which may be described as a state of expectation, like expectant suspense about her own actions.
When she moves towards this independence, and when it's rejected, then she starts to look at her father as something lesser than she used to, and she begins to discover herself more.
Yeah, and we could say one of the phrase that she said to her father, "If I don't obey you, I ought not live with you to enjoy your kindness and protection." So this is when I think she decided to not obey her father.
Although she's eventually depicted as an admirable old maid, she is the one now making decisions about her time and her future and fortune. So we can't say that this is a negative. She's gone from being a shy child to someone who's in control of her own mind and powers.
Yeah. So our next main theme that we have, this is loss and idealization. And this is seen just right from the very first pages of the book, where Dr. Sloper, an acclaimed physician, suffers the stigma of his young son's death and later the death of his beloved wife.
This is one of the problems. Like, he has idealized his dead wife so much that he doesn't even see the daughter in front of him. He has reduced her to a kind of shadow of the memory of his wife.
Yeah, so Dr. Sloper never gets over his grief and remaining this unemotional to his daughter, and Catherine's inheritance, he made Catherine's inheritance less attractive for Morris because he really, later he showed this, that he really cared of his daughter.
In essence, this novel celebrates the small victories in Catherine's life, sure, but overall it's a bit of a tragedy. Her losses are too great.
Yes, and that takes us to another main theme, wealth and social status. At the beginning of Washington Square, James describes the young United States as a country in which to play a social part, you must either earn your income or make believe that you earn it. Like if we look at Morris, he would rather be the one who just pretends that he earns some kind of income.
This is a statement on American society at that time. This conflict between Morris and Catherine's father centers over the fact that Morris is perceived as this kind of fortune hunter. He's trying to marry, he's kind of a gold digger. But James is saying that American society is also kind of stuck in this weird space where people they have affluence coming into them, they're becoming richer, but they maybe don't know how to behave properly.
So actually Sloper has earned his income by being a good doctor. Actually, his wife's fortune really helped him to set up everything in his life that after he didn't really care about his income.
Very good. We have a question for the audience now. Can we justify idealizing a person by love?
Maybe it's possible to idealize a person, especially after losing him or her, but this shouldn't become the reason for hating your own daughter.
Very good answer.
Of course, definitely. Thank you very much. And we have another question for you. Is being disobedient the way to independence?
No, it's not always the case. Being disobedient sometimes means just being protesting something, and it does not mean you gain independence.
That's a nice message for many teenagers, I would say. Yeah?
Well, Ms. Maka, why don't we start to wrap things up?
Yep, of course, it is high time. We started with the author, Henry James, who is one of the greatest American writers of history.
Definitely. We looked at the summary. It's a story of this sweet girl and the conflict with her unemotional father.
Yep, then we looked at the characters where we again have Catherine, the main protagonist of the novel, her father, Mr. Sloper, and kind of lazy Morris.
And then we looked at the setting, mid-19th century, Manhattan, New York.
And of course, the main themes that we have chosen for you, this is gaining some kind of independence, loss and idealization, and wealth and social status.
Let's have a look at the word list once more. And here they are: vow, prudent, impoverished, to extend, spinster, dismissive, threat, and restriction.
Thanks for helping us to pronounce it correctly, and let's move on to the homework part.
We have a question for the audience, and this is it. Give advice to someone who tries to become independent in life. What should this person do? What are the signs of being an independent human being?
დაწერეთ რჩევა ადამიანისთვის, რომელიც ცდილობს გახდეს დამოუკიდებელი. რა უნდა გააკეთოს მან? რა არის დამოუკიდებელი ადამიანის მახასიათებლები?
And those answers can be sent to the address on the screen right now.
პასუხები გამოაგზავნეთ ეკრანზე მითითებულ მისამართზე.
So, Ms. Maka, do you think that this kind of unemotionalness from the father could it qualify as a kind of abuse, emotional abuse?
Of course, because it somehow had a problem on Catherine from childhood. So of course it is considered to be a little bit of abuse.
So although he hasn't actually done anything to her, sometimes by not doing anything, it has a negative effect.
As if psychologist interferes in this case, definitely she would find lots of inappropriate behavior from the father.
Okay then, well, we should thank our audience.
Of course, for those interesting discussions and answers. Thank you, the TV audience, for listening.
Thank you for presenting.
You too, of course. And I guess that's time to say goodbye.
Until next week, goodbye.
Goodbye.